Hi there, welcome to the first video of our very first Yarn Much Knit Along. Today we're going to cover going through the pattern, familiarizing yourself with the pattern, swatching, and eventually casting on. As you all probably know, we are planning to knit the Flax Pullover by Tin Can Knits. Most of you are working the worsted weight version. There are a few of you that are working the Flax Light Pullover. I will be referencing the worsted weight version in this video. If you are following along and doing the fingering weight version, your techniques will be the same, everything will be the same, you'll just be using different yarn sizes, different stitch counts, etc. So if you are doing the light version, this video is still for you. That's the information on the pattern. You can download the free pattern off of Ravelry if you haven't already. Print out a copy and you can follow along with me as we go through the pattern. I did create a group on Ravelry, the Yarn Much Ravelry group page. I created a thread for this knit along, so feel free to post your questions there. Feel free to post pictures of the progress that you're making with your sweater. Also, if you have any tips or tricks that you've learned over the years of knitting sweaters, please post them there. I am not the expert on sweater knit. I am just the facilitator and moderator of this knit along. So if you have other things that you've learned over the years, please feel free to share those with me and with everybody else in the group. The first thing we're going to do today is familiarize yourself with the pattern that you're going to be working on. I always like to print out the pattern. I grab my highlighter and my pen. The first thing I do is read it in its entirety. I read the whole pattern from top to bottom, every page. There's going to be pieces that you're going to read that you won't understand. Don't worry about it. We're going to cover everything. You know what size you are knitting. So Tin Can Knits has an amazing pattern because they have all sizes, including newborn to 6XL. So it is an all-inclusive pattern, which is great, but it also makes it really confusing when you're looking at all of those numbers and counts when you look through the pattern. So on the first page of the pattern, you'll see this little chart that has all of your sizes. Most of you have already picked which size you're going to be knitting. So the first thing I do as I'm reading through the pattern is I find the size I'm knitting and I highlight the stitch count every time I see that big long list of numbers. You'll understand what I mean when you look at the pattern. So if I'm knitting the 4 to 6 child size, I'm looking for the 5th number in that long line of numbers. I take my highlighter and I just go through and I highlight that number every time I see anything that pertains to the size that I'm making. If you're making the large size, you're going to be looking to highlight the 6th bold type number on the pattern. Again, you'll understand as you're looking at the pattern. Okay, now that we've familiarized ourselves with the pattern, now it's time to jump into the knitting. You don't get to jump right into knitting your sweater. First, we have to do a swatch. The swatch is just to make sure that the sweater that you knit at the end is going to be exactly the size that you want it to be. So we'll take this slowly. The pattern calls for 18 stitches and 22 rows of knitting to create a 4 by 4 inch swatch. So what that means is that the stockinette portion of this swatch should measure 4 by 4 when I'm all finished. The way that I like to do my swatches is, especially if I'm doing a stockinette swatch, because stockinette has a tendency to curl in on the sides, I like to do a garter stitch border around it. So in this case, I'm casting on 28 stitches. And the reason I do this is because I know I need 18 stitches in stockinette, and then I give myself 5 stitches for garter on each side. So for your swatch, you will knit 5 rows, and then you will knit 5, purl your 18, knit 5, and you'll continue knitting and purling all the way through 22 rows of stockinette. And then at the end, I usually just do 5 rows of garter stitch, and then you can use this as a coaster or something else later. After you knit your swatch, you'll need to wash and dry the swatch based on the instructions on the yarn label. Most of us are using the Cascade 220 Superwash Merino wool. This yarn says machine wash cool, tumble dry low. So that's exactly how you have to treat this yarn. Pop this into your washing machine, wash it on cool, take it out, toss it into the dryer, and tumble dry it on low. I usually only dry my hand knitted items till they're about 3/4 of the way dry, just because I like to bring them out, lay them flat, make sure that there's no creases in them. This is my pre-washed swatch and my after washing swatch. You'll notice a huge difference in how the material feels. It's lighter, it's softer. And hopefully you'll measure 4 inches. So here's the big question of the day. Did you meet gauge with your size 8 needle? So what we'll do is you want to put your swatch down on a flat surface. Just make sure your corners are straight, but don't stretch it. Lay your swatch, and you're going to measure only the garter stitch portion in between. So when I lay my ruler down, my 18 stitches measure 4 inches. So my size 8 needles right on gauge. If by chance you measure your swatch and you do not hit that 4-inch mark, you can easily go up or down in needle size to make those stitches fit in the 4 inches. So if you measure your swatch and your 18 stitches measure more than 4 inches, then you're going to want to decrease your needle size in order to get those stitches into a smaller space. If you happen to measure less than 4 inches, then you're going to want to increase your needle size to make those stitches bigger to be sure that you stretch them to the whole 4 inches. I hope that makes sense. The other part of swatching is the row gauge. This is not as important as the stitch gauge. I always tell people, don't focus on the row gauge. If you happen to hit 4 inches for 22 rows, that's fantastic. But I very rarely do. Most patterns will tell you to knit for 4 inches versus telling you to knit 25 rows. So in this case, row gauge just isn't that important. You are able to try on your sweater as you knit, so you know exactly how long you want it, how many inches you want to knit it, and it doesn't really, the row gauge is not important. You cannot change needle size and only change one or the other. If you change your needle size, you're going to affect both stitch gauge and row gauge. I say focus on the stitch gauge. Don't worry about the row gauge. If you happen to hit it, great. We'll all celebrate with you. Okay, now that you have your gauge swatch set, you know which needle sizes that you're using, you can start knitting your sweater. This particular sweater is a top-down raglan sweater, which means that you start at the top and you go all the way down to here, separate for the sleeves, knit the body, then we come back and knit the sleeves. So this pattern has 2 different options for knitting the sweater. We're going to go with option 1. If you choose to do option 2, that is absolutely fine. I'm always here to help, but what we'll cover in this video is option 1, which is just starting at the collar and doing the ribbing. Option 2 has you starting at the increased raglans, and then you go back after the sweater's complete and pick up and knit the ribbing. So we're just going to start from the beginning and take it from there. So you have already gone through your pattern. You've highlighted all of the numbers that pertain to the size that you're making. So in my case, I am knitting the 4 to 6 year old child sweater. So I need to cast on 74 stitches. I'm going to simply cast on this. This particular pattern doesn't give you any particular cast on to use. So you use the cast on that you're most comfortable with. So here are my 74 stitches cast on. Again, my 74 stitches is not necessarily the size that you're making, but you already established that by going through your pattern and highlighting your numbers. So the next step, I'm sure you've all knit in the round before, but if not, it's as simple as this. you want to make sure all your stitches are facing the same way, all the same direction. So all of your cast on knots should be on the inside of your needle. You want to have the working yarn coming from your right needle. You slip on your stitch marker, and that's your beginning of the round stitch marker, and you want to make sure that this is a unique marker. You won't use other markers in this project that look like this because you always need to know your beginning of round. All you need to do to join it in the round is take your right needle with the working yarn, insert it into the first stitch on the left needle, wrap it, pull it through, and that's it. That's your first stitch. That's your first knit stitch. So the pattern calls for you to do 1 or 1.5 inches of ribbing. So you already have your first knit stitch, and then you're going to want to purl the next stitch and knit purl all the way around for either 1 inch if you're making a child size or 1.5 inches if you're making the adult size. So here's my work in progress, knitting around, doing the ribbing. I still have a few more rounds to go. After this, we're going to be actually putting stitch markers in to set up the raglan increases, which is the increases for your shoulders and which makes the sweater wearable over your shoulders. So for future planning, you're going to need 7 additional stitch markers different from your beginning of round stitch marker. In the next video, we'll go over setting up those raglan increases and also setting up the garter stitch that goes down the sleeve. For now, that's it. Happy knitting, and we'll see you soon.